لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya, we've reached Bab al-Tawkid. And we'll see structurally, Tawkid doesn't change that much from the Ajrumiyya in the Mutammima, right? So he tells us Tawkid is lafzi and ma'nawi. Lafzi repeats the same words. Ma'nawi, right, is where Tawkid is made using words that convey the meaning of Tawkid, and there's a select number of words. And he mentions more rulings related to the aspects of the Tawkid al-Ma'nawi, right? So he mentions for nafs and ayn a number of rulings, right? And then it's a tabi', so it follows in the matbu' in key characteristics that we will see. So, Umar, could you read?
باب التوكيد والتوكيد ضربان لفظي ومعنوي.
Right? التوكيد ضربان, right? Now, something, of course, by now you should have looked up something like what does darb mean, right? Because the regular meaning of darb is hitting, so we know that's probably not talking about hitting. So then, and we kind of know that the Tawkid that darb here is like qism, but what is the meaning, right? That's really important, right? If you see a word, especially if you see it again, that you need to look for its meaning. So Tawkid, التوكيد ضربان لفظي ومعنوي. Go ahead.
فاللفظي إعادة اللفظ الأول بعينه سواء كان اسما نحو جاء زيد زيد أو فعلا نحو أتاك لاحق نحبي سحبيسي.
Right? So توكيد لفظي فاللفظي إعادة اللفظ الأول بعينه. Just repeating the same word, and it conveys emphasis. جاء زيد زيد, right? And the Tawkid lafzi is actually the asl, insofar as it's the simplest and most obvious way of Tawkid. So you'll notice, of course, he doesn't give us a definition, right, of what is Tawkid. Right? He says it's darban. One reason being that the lexical meaning of Tawkid or ta'kid, akkada yu'akkidu, to emphasize, right? Right? So it's contextually we know it's a tabi', and its role is evident from its usage. And Ibn Malik defined it that it is تابع يقصد به كون المتبوع على ظاهره. Right? So it's a تابع. يقصد به كون المتبوع على ظاهره. Right? That it's the primary usage of it is أن يكون المتبوع على ظاهره. So what's the primary emphasis it does? That it's literal. Right? It's on the outward meaning of the thing, not just because it could be جاء زيد, right? That his letter has come, or etc. Right? And that's used by the Arabs. وجاء ينزل ربنا, right? كل ليلة إلى سماء الدنيا. Our Lord descends. جاء ربك, right? Your Lord has come. Allah doesn't move, right? So that's the purpose, right? جاء زيد زيد, because it could be جاء زيد like his servant came with a message from Zayd, right? Something. أو فعلا, right? And this is quite dramatic. أتاك اللاحقون احبسي احبسي. Right? So, right? As part of a longer line, أتاك اللاحقون. لاحق is the one who's, because you have the sabiq in Arabic, you have the sabiq and the lahiq. Sabiq is the one ahead, and the lahiq is the one behind, right? In the sense of if they're racing, right? Right? Now, when you look up words, it's very important to pay attention to what bab are they from. So that's why, Al-Ahdal, for example, mentions هو من لحق من باب تعب. تعب يتعب, لحق يلحق. Right? So those catching up to you have come. احبسي احبسي. احبس يعني حبس can refer. Now with classical Arabic, then this the habs can be used for hiding something, but it also can mean, it just means habs is that which prevents. Here احبسي means كفي عن السير. Right? Stop traveling. Right? So those catching up to you have caught up with you. So stop. Okay. أو حرفا نحو قول الشاعر لا أبوح بحب بثين. You have بثينة بثنة. بحب بثنة إنها أخذت علي مواثق وعهودا. Very باح is to disclose. Right? باح بسره, that's usually the expression. Right? To disclose what we were hiding or supposed to hide. Right? Right? لا أبوح بحب بثنة. No, I will not disclose my love for Bathna. She has taken from me mawathiq, plural of mithaq, covenants, right? Wa'uhuda, and commitments. And of course, by doing that, he's disclosed it, right? Right? And there's a context to the story, but so the example is that the tawkid can be of an ism or a fi'l or even a harf like la. And this idea of hiding love, right, is one of the things that the poets, of course, talked a lot about, both pre-Islamic and in the Islamic period, right? بسر إنباح تباح دماؤهم وكذا دماء البائحين تباح. With a secret, if they disclosed it, إنباح تباح دماؤهم, their blood becomes mubah, becomes halal. كذا دماء البائحين تباح. أو جملة, or a whole sentence, ضربت زيدا ضربت زيدا, right? And it can have many rhetorical reasons as well, right? And one is that I actually did it, but also it could be على الحسرة, يعني, and it could be out of regret, it could be out of celebration, there could be different reasons. Okay. والمعنوي, and the second type of tawkid is tawkid معنوي وله ألفاظ معلومة وهي Now there's a little fa'idah that the Arabs considered tawkid more than 3 times to be improper. Right? Al-Ahdal has a nice fa'idah there that you can see. He has tanbih and a fa'idah. So he has a tanbih, and you can read that. That tanbih is actually quite useful because it has to do with a Quranic verse, right? But that sort of highlights, and that's why it's good to ask questions. Someone asks a question about a particular i'rab of the Quran and so on, right? And we mentioned this thing that, and it was that's why it's good to ask 100 questions, even if 60 are good. The only way we can sharpen our understanding of the subjects and also the tools and the books is by messing up, right? Like I learned about, like I used to prod Dr. Ustad Mahmoud al-Bayruti, hafidhahullah, about different editors, right? And sometimes, like, I got to know him really well. I said, no, like, why? But because he teaches here, like, I'd bring my proofs. You said, give his editing a miss, but he teaches here at this madrasa, at this mahad, and he teaches this, and this, and so praise. So are you done? I said, yes. I said, drink a little bit of tea. I said, okay. He said, does any of those things qualify you to edit a book? I said, no. I said, exactly. Right? That's a common mistake. Just because someone teaches somewhere means they're a teacher. Right? They're qualified as a scholar. That's a separate skill set from, are you able to edit a book? No. Are you able to do takhrij of hadith? According to publishing, like according to the standards? No. Right? So So there's a little thing that dakkan, dakka, and saffa, for example, neither of them is from Tawkid, according to the majority. According to the Ahl al-Tafsir. Right? And there's ikhtilaf in it. Right? But this is where even like the ulama of tafsir and the grammarians may differ on the i'rab of something. Right? Because the grammarian, the nahwi, is just looking at outwardly. It's like he's looking, okay, this is the construction of the sentence. It's coherent as this being tawkid. But i'rab relies on meaning. Meaning appears through i'rab. But the hakim on tafsir is the mufassir, not the nahwi. But there is ikhtilaf about that, even amongst some of the great grammarians. But it's just a fact that you don't have to read it, but just note it. But this is where whose i'rab of the Quran you rely upon is very sensitive. And the nature of the Quran is multiple i'rabs are often possible. Okay. وهي النفس والعين وكل وجميع وعامة وكل وكل وكلتا. Right? So he gives us the ahkam of these. ويجب اتصالها بضمير مطابق للمؤكد. Is it للمؤكد or للمؤكد, folks? Why? Because in fact he says so? No. So this is where good preparation comes in. Like it could be mu'akkad or mu'akkid. Mu'akkad is the object, the mu'akkid is the ism fa'il, completely opposite meanings, right? So good preparation, basic preparation will be to notice it and at least put, okay, which one is it? So when you come to class, it's either answered or raised. Okay. نحو جاء الخليفة نفسه أو عينه. Because khalifa, it's مؤنث لفظا لا معنى, right? It's not مؤنث. You don't say جاءت الخليفة. Khalifa is, although it's a ta marbuta, it's a male word, right? It's a male word, right? Okay. أو عينه ولك أن تجمع بينهما. So these are the ahkam, and we will put these in notes on separate lines. These are the ahkam. لك أن تجمع بينهما. بين ماذا؟ بين يعني بين المؤكدات اللفظية المعنوية بشرط أن تقدم النفس. Right? So you say, for example, like if, right? You say جاء زيد نفسه عينه. So nafs would come first, and this is like if nafs is used, then it would have to come first. That's a stronger opinion. Why? Because of the usage of the Arabs. ويجب إفراد النفس والعين مع المفرد. Right? Nafs and ayn must be in the singular with the mufrad. Right? Whether male or female. Right? And he'll give an example of that in a moment, right? وجمعهما على أفعل مع المثنى والجمع. تقول جاء الزيدان أنفسهما أعينهما، وجاء الزيدون أنفسهم أو أعينهم. وكل وجميع وعامة يؤكد بها المفرد والجمع ولا يؤكد بها المثنى. Why? Because the Arabs didn't use it. تقول جاء الجيش كله، أو جاء الجيش جميعه، جاء الجيش عامته، وجاءت القبيلة كلها، جاءت القبيلة جميعها، جاءت القبيلة عامتها، جاء الرجال كلهم جميعهم عامتهم، وجاءت النساء كلهن أو جميعهن أو عامتهن. Of course it's جاءت النساء وعامتهن. وكلا وكلتا يؤكد بهما المثنى، نحو جاء الزيدان كلاهما، وجاءت الهندات كلتاهما. Okay, so these are أحكام. Most of these have been mentioned before. وإذا أريد تقوية التأكيد فيجوز أن يؤتى بعد كله بأجمع وبعد كلها بجمعاء, and that in modern Arabic would be rare. وبعد كلهم بأجمعين وبعد كلهن بجمع. يعني قال الله تعالى فسجد الملائكة كلهم أجمعون. ويقال جاء الجيش كله أجمع. Right? Again, أجمع in that kind of context, in usage, you have to pay attention to Arabs who speak Fusha, how it's being used. والنساء جاءت النساء كلهن, and how is it pronounced? جمع على وزن عمر. Right? كلهن جمع. Correct? Right? And this is rare. وقد يؤكد بأجمع وجمعاء وأجمعين وجمع بدون كل، نحو لأغوينهم أجمعين. The most common is for there to be كل and then أجمع, or جمعاء أجمعين جمع. وقد يؤتى بعد أجمع بتوابعه. So these are توابع that are unique to أجمع, وهي, and these not used in day to day. أكتع وأبصع وأبتع، نحو جاء القوم كلهم أجمعون أكتعون أبصعون أبتعون، وهي بمعنى واحد ولذلك لا يعطف بعضها على بعض. Right? You'd only say جاء القوم كلهم أجمعون أكتعون, or أجمعون أبصعون, or أجمعون أبتعون. And this is a قاعدة of معنى. لأن الشيء الواحد لا يعطف بعضه على بعض. العطف, they say العطف يقتضي المغايرة. عطف indicates that the two things are different. Right? Right? And there's multiple ways the grammarians mention that, right? Al-atf yaqtadi al-mughayara. And that's a very useful principle, like in terms of the attributes and many other things. That has theological implications too. And you can take what Al-Ahdal mentions here in brief. without getting lost in the details. Okay. والتوكيد تابع للمؤكد في رفعه ونصبه وخفضه وتعريفه. Right? ولا يجوز توكيد النكرة عند البصريين. Right? And that's the عند البصريين, of course, indicated there's khilaf of the so توكيد النكرة, this is بألفاظ التوكيد المعنوي. Right? The Kufiyun allowed it, but and there's khilaf about this, right? There's tafsil. And the Kufis weren't always wrong. Here, Ibn Malik actually agreed with the Kufis لصحة السماع به, with conditions. But don't just put and interestingly, but it's interesting. It has practical purposes because Ibn Hisham himself used as a shahid for this, and Al-Ahdal says in fil awdah, and al-awdah, the al here is iwad an lafz, right? Is awdah, al-awdah is awdahul masalik, right? في شرح ألفية بن مالك, right? And the proof he used is ما صام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم شهرا كله إلا رمضان. So شهرا is nakira, كله appears to be tawkid for shahran. Now there's controversy that is hadith proof in grammar because of the possibility that it could be marwi بالمعنى دون لفظه. But there's other ways that it's understood. Okay. Then, so that's tawkid. Tawkid is quite straightforward, but using it, again, because it relates strongly to meaning, and meanings are conveyed according to usage. And usage is very contextual, right? That if you were in a Abbasid court, keep quiet until you figure out how they speak, right? And the asl is taqleed, but with understanding, right? And so when we've talked about that. باب البدل هو التابع المقصود بالحكم بلا واسطة, right? So the tabi' هو المقصود بالحكم, such that the حكم applies directly to it just as it applies to the asl. بلا واسطة. There's no right? Because na'at is not maqsood bil hukum. جاء زيد الكريم, right, is not المقصود بالحكم. The hukum is المجيء, right? Right? So not عطف, again, not is excluded. Tawkid is excluded, right? جاء كلهم, جاء الرجال كلهم. Can you just say جاء كلهم? No, right? It's not المقصود بالحكم, right? It supports the حكم, right? And عطف البيان as well. right? وإذا أبدل اسم من اسم أو فعل من فعل تبعه في جميع إعرابه. If an ism is a badal for an ism, or a fi'l is a badal for a fi'l, it follows it in all its i'rab. والبدل على أربعة أقسام. The badal is of 4 types. الأول بدل الشيء من الشيء، ويقال بدل الكل من الكل. These are 2 similar expressions. نحو جاء زيد أخوك. You could just say جاء أخوك. And here we need to clarify 3 things students remain confused about, which is, what's the difference between na'at and atf bayan, and what's the difference between atf bayan and badal. جاء زيد أخوك. قال الله سبحانه وتعالى حكاية عن المؤمن: اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين. What's the shahid? What's the shahid?
Sirata in the second ayah is badal of as-sirata from the first ayah.
Are you sure? Are you sure? Okay, good. It's good to do i'rab of these. And again, like, so al-Ahdal, for example, is a distinguished scholar. And this is why knowing the biographies of the ulama that whose works one accesses and finding out more about them also gives on, okay, what can I take from this person and what can't I take? And the ulama praise al-Ahdal significantly, right? And he was a distinguished jurist and was a well-rounded alim, right? And he's a late scholar, so he's building. So his points of tafsir and stuff are very, very beneficial, right? And he has some really nice points about what is a sirat al-mustaqim, etc. So this would be very beneficial to look at. Okay. وقال تعالى إلى صراط العزيز الحميد. الله. إلى صراط العزيز الحميد. في قراءة الجر. في قراءة الجر of what? Of لفظ الجلالة. Right, so it's badal. It's of this, it is this kind of badal. But it's not proper. We have to be very careful how we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and these kinds of things. That's the other thing about, you know, where one gets one's i'rab from. الثاني بدل البعض من الكل سواء كان ذلك البعض قليلا أو كثيرا. And that's خلافا لبعضهم. That's why they mention these quyud, but you don't have to pay attention to who said what, but they point to that, so one notes that and one could fill it in later. قليلا أو كثيرا نحو أكلت الرغيف, you know, the piece of bread, ثلثه. أكلت الرغيف نصفه. أكلت الرغيف ثلثيه. Right? ولا بد من اتصاله بضمير يرجع للمبدل منه كالأمثلة يعني عفوا إما مذكور كالأمثلة أو مقدر. Right? So to connect the badal, there must be something, there must be a connector. It can be explicit, but in the badal, you know, in what did he refer to? Badal al-ba'd min al-kull. How do we connect the ba'd to the kull? It needs a dhamir yarji ilayhi to connect the two things. أو مقدر, or it's implicit. كقوله ولله على الناس حج البيت من استطاع إليه سبيلا من استطاع أي منهم, and that connects it back. الثالث بدل اشتمال. بدل اشتمال, it's not part of it, but it is something within the person, right? Because so the distinction between بدل اشتمال and بدل بعض من الكل, the رغيف, the thuluth is a specific part of it. A third, this is the bread, يعني علمه, جماله, يعني نطقه, right? This is, so they give a definition of اشتمال, right? Right? So, because the relationship in بدل بعض من الكل is a relationship of كلية and جزئية. But in اشتمال, شمل is something containing another, right? So اشتمال, right? That this meaning is contained within it, but it's not a piece of it. It's not a distinct part. The relationship is not of جزئية and كلية. And you can review in the شرح الخريدة the relationship between جزئية and كلية and جزء and كل, right? Okay. That's a separate thing. But اشتمال, عجبني زيد علمه, and you can عجبني زيد كله, ولا بد من اتصاله بضمير إما مذكور كالمثال أو مقدر كقوله قتل أصحاب الأخدود النار ذات الوقود, أي فيه, right? قتل, of course, قتل here is معنى اللعن, right? أي لعن أصحاب الأخدود, and the أخدود was the pit that they dug to bury the believers and burn them, right? They put a great fire and threw in the believers, right? And you can read, and Al-Ahdal brings the reference to the hadith in Sahih Muslim, right? Right? And it was not that far from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, 70 years before his bi'atha. Okay. والرابع البدل المباين. And does the Ajrumiyya use this expression? Right, so here he does an expansion. وهو ثلاثة أقسام. بدل الغلط. You just made a mistake, so you corrected it without saying I'm sorry. وبدل النسيان. وبدل الإضراب. And they're similar. You can catch the definitions of each between أهدل and فاكه رحمهم الله. نحو رأيت زيدا الفرس. And sometimes these are used to make a point, and sometimes it's innocent. Right? We don't know the, right? لأنك أردت أن تقول رأيت الفرس فغلطت فقلت زيدا, فهذا بدل الغلط. وإن قلت رأيت زيدا ثم لما نطقت تذكرت أنك إنما رأيت فرسا فأبدلته منه, فهذا بدل النسيان. وإن أردت الإخبار أولا بأنك رأيت زيدا ثم بدا لك أن تخبر بأنك رأيت الفرس, فهذا بدل الإضراب. And he makes a point that the three are one, and they go back to the qasd, right? And Al-Faqih, he mentions that some of the grammarians said there's a fifth category, which is badal الكل من البعض, but they didn't accept it, basically. So that's the badal. And then he says, ومثال الفعل, we'll stop at the مثال الفعل. نسأل الله حسن الفعل والفعال. So we're getting very close to the ending, folks, so let's ensure that our review is in good order. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.